Constitution. All right, so today's lecture is on the Bill of Rights and judicial review. And so the first thing to talk about is, why do we even have a Bill of Rights? Right? Now, we've studied the Constitution, so we already have some background knowledge here, but it goes back to the debate over whether we are going to ratify the Constitution or not. Okay? If you remember, when we first wrote the Constitution, there was no Bill of Rights. Right? It wasn't included. And the Anti-Federalists, remember that term, Anti-Federalists, were worried that without a Bill of Rights, the national government would be too powerful. Without a Bill of Rights, they worried the national government would be too powerful. And so the Anti-Federalists refused to support the new Constitution unless it included a Bill of Rights. In order to get the Constitution passed, the Federalists agreed to write one. Specifically, they said, all right, we're going to write up a Bill of Rights that will protect people's civil rights and civil liberties. Write up a Bill of Rights that will protect Americans' civil rights and civil liberties. So I'm going to give you a definition for each of those. Because they're kind of like two sides of the same coin in some ways. But they're both very important, okay? Civil rights are promises by the government of equal rights and fair treatment under the law. I'll say that again. Civil rights are promises by the government of equal rights and fair treatment under the law. So this includes things like the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, the right to remain silent. Those are civil rights. Civil liberties, on the other hand, are the basic freedoms that are considered to be the birthright of citizens. Civil liberties are the basic freedoms that are considered to be the birthright of citizens. And that would include things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As well as the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. So let's talk about those First Amendment civil liberties. You've got a little outline under Roman numeral 2 that talks about the 5 essential freedoms of the First Amendment. The first one listed is the freedom of religion. We need to understand that the freedom of religion is broken into 2 parts. The First Amendment says that the freedom of religion involves the Establishment Clause. And this basically says that the government cannot establish a national religion. This is where we get the idea of a separation of church and state. You've probably heard that before, right? Separation of church and state. That comes from the Establishment Clause, right? The government may not establish a national religion. The second part of freedom of religion is the Free Exercise Clause. Which allows you to freely exercise the religion of your choice. Basically, that means the government cannot keep you from practicing whatever religion you choose. You are free to exercise whatever beliefs you want. So if you're Jewish, that's allowed. If you're Catholic, that's allowed. If you're Buddhist, that's allowed. If you want to worship the trees, that's allowed. Right? If you want to be atheist and follow no religion at all, that's also allowed. The government can't tell you that you cannot follow certain religions. Now, when we get into our case studies and we take a look at some real-life cases of freedom of religion, we're going to see there's some limits there, right? But those are the 2 parts of freedom of religion. The next freedom included in the First Amendment is the one that most people probably think of first, which is what? Speech. Freedom of speech. Okay? So we've got freedom of religion. And it's got 2 parts. We have freedom of speech. We have the freedom of the press. That's the third one. We have the freedom of assembly. Which means you have the right to peacefully gather. And the one that people probably have the hardest time remembering is the freedom of petition. Which a petition means basically a written protest. Okay, petition means the ability to send a written protest to your representatives, to your government. We probably don't use this one quite as much today, but this was really big back when the Constitution was written. right? Think about when the colonies were dealing with all the taxes and the rules from England, right? We sent petitions off to Parliament and to the king. And we still do this today, right? People still send petitions around, get a whole lot of signatures to say we feel there's a problem we want to address. So we do use it, right? But these are your First Amendment, the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment that are at the heart of the Bill of Rights, right? There's a reason it's the First Amendment. Right? We would consider these to be your birthright. You are born an American citizen, and therefore you have these freedoms. Let's continue on. Amendments 2, 3, and 4 are protections against abuses by the government. Right? They're protections against the government's power. Most of you probably know what the Second Amendment is. What's the Second Amendment?
The right to bear arms.
The right to bear arms, he says as he rolls his sleeve up. Wrong, bear arms. So, make sure that we do the right to bear arms, because if you spell B-A-R-E would mean my sleeves are up.
Yeah, I said bear like naked.
This is bear, which is a little confusing because it's bear like, "Rrr." But that's not what that means. It doesn't mean you get hairy arms with claws. To bear something means to own it, to carry it. Okay? So the right to bear arms would be you have the right to own a weapon. Now that gets fairly controversial these days because what it actually says is a well-regulated militia being necessary for the protection of its citizens, right? The government cannot infringe on your right to bear arms. Well, gosh, a well-regulated militia back then meant that, you owned a musket, right? So there's a lot of debate over that, the Second Amendment, particularly in the light of, the shootings that we unfortunately seem to more frequently be seeing on the news, right? Most recently in Las Vegas. So this is a hot button topic. It's in the Constitution. It's a constitutional protection. But what does that mean, right? Does that mean you own a musket, or does it mean that you have the right to a hunting rifle? Does it mean you have the right to a semi-automatic weapon? Does it mean you have the right to a handgun? Those things weren't around when the Constitution was written. So these are really, really important constitutional questions that our government has to wrestle with. The Third Amendment protects American citizens from having to quarter soldiers. Basically, it says that you do not have to quarter soldiers. What does that mean, to quarter soldiers?
Keeping them in your house.
Cut them into points. Oh, sorry, wrong quartering. Right, it means you do not have to provide them quarter, which means house them and feed them. You do not have to house them. The government cannot make you house and feed soldiers. This has really never been an issue for us. I can't think of a single time where that's become an issue. But it was an issue under Great Britain. Right? If you remember, when Great Britain took over Boston, we're actually going over this with 10th graders right now. When they took over Boston, they forced the citizens to house the soldiers. And we said, ooh, we didn't like that. Right? So the Constitution allows for an army, but we will not make our citizens house and feed soldiers. The Fourth Amendment provides you protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Put another way, the police just can't kick down your door and dig around your house, right? They have to have a warrant. They have to have a good reason. We are going to look at several search and seizure cases, right? Because the police don't always have to have a warrant, right? If you're walking down the street smoking a joint, they're going to stop you and arrest you, right? You can't be like, oh, you can't search me. So we're going to look at some cases that go into this, right? When do they have to have a warrant? When don't they? But those three amendments, 2, 3, and 4, were really put in there to protect you against the government abusing its power, okay? The next 4, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, all deal with your rights under the legal system. The 5th Amendment covers a lot of different things. I got into like some poison ivy or something. That's yucky. Glad you're concerned. Can tell.
No, my sinus is just hurt. I'm in pain.
No, you're concerned about me.
Okay.
We know he's not going to use that review.
All of my YouTube subscribers are concerned about me too. All 70 of them.
You said 80.
That's close to 80. The 5th Amendment does a lot, okay? And you've probably heard the term pleading the 5th before, right? The 5th what? The 5th Amendment, okay? Long story short, the 5th Amendment protects the rights of people who are accused of a crime, right? All the different parts of it kind of together, they protect the rights of people who are accused of a crime. It also includes it sort of like sticks out like a sore thumb. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the amendment, but it also includes a part where it says the government may not take private property without fairly paying for it.
Is this in the 5th Amendment?
That's also in the 5th. It's kind of weird because most of the 5th Amendment provides protections for people who are accused of a crime, right? You don't have to testify against yourself, right? That's that right to remain silent piece.
Wait, without.
But then there's this extra part where it basically just says the government cannot take private property without fairly paying for it. The government can take private property. If they want to take your house and knock it down and put a highway through, they can do that.
Yeah, they did that to my grandfather's farm.
Yeah. If they want to take part of your property and put a pipeline through it, they can do that. They just can't take it without paying you a fair price. They can't say, hey, your property's worth $300,000, but we're gonna rip it all up and put a highway through and we'll give you 20 grand for it. No, you can sue the government at that point and say, look, it sucks bad enough you're taking my property, but the Constitution says if you're going to take it, you have to pay me a fair price. And a fair price is what it's worth, not some ripoff, okay? So that's kind of oddly in there with the 5th, but the rest of it has to do with basically protecting the rights of people who are accused of a crime. The 6th Amendment and the 7th Amendment, both, one of them has to do with criminal trials, and the other has to do with civil trials. The difference isn't really all that important for our purposes. They both promise the right to a fair trial. We get that right to a fair trial from the 6th and 7th Amendments. And the 8th Amendment protects against two different things. First off, it protects against excessive bail. And it protects against cruel and unusual punishment.
So would excessive bail be like you can't
First off, what is bail?
like the money that you pay? Is this what we're talking about? The way that you pay to kind of stay out of jail for a little bit.
No,
While you're
trial.
awaiting
Yeah,
trial.
yeah.
So bail is if you're accused of a crime and you're awaiting trial, right? Let's say your trial's not going to be for 2 months, right? Because the court's backed up. If you can post bail, that means they'll let you out of jail until your trial, right? The bail is basically like, hey, here's this money for you to hold on to as a promise that I'm going to come back, right? And so they'll set a bail, and if you can meet the bail, then they'll let you out of jail. If you can't meet the bail, then they keep you in jail. And sometimes, if it's somebody who's particularly violent or they're worried that it's a flight risk, like if we let you out, you're going to flee the country, they'll deny bail. The judge will say, you don't get a bail because we're worried you're going to run away. But so excessive bail would mean something that's very unreasonable. Hey, you're accused of shoplifting $1,000 worth of stuff. Your bail is set at $50 million. Right? We would say that's probably a little bit excessive. Okay? So you're protected against that. And then if you are found guilty of a crime, you are protected against cruel and unusual punishment. Right? So they can't torture you.
Well, like the FBI can, the CIA, right?
Well, that's first off, that's a very questionable, right, kind of murky ethical and constitutional issue.
Yeah.
Secondly, you get into some. Remember, these are who do these protect the rights of? Americans, right? So some people who've advocated for the use of torture or what some would call enhanced interrogation techniques would say, well, the Constitution doesn't apply to non-Americans, right? And again, like I said, that there's a whole host of ethical and moral questions raised by that, right? But in terms of for our study, if you end up going to prison, they cannot cruelly and unusually punish you. All right, the last two in the Bill of Rights, the 9th and 10th Amendment, deal with rights and powers that belong to the states and the people. The 9th Amendment is kind of like the Constitution's safety net. It says that people have rights that go beyond the ones that are listed in the Constitution. People have rights that go beyond the ones that are listed in the Constitution. There was a real concern when they were coming up with this Bill of Rights that, hey, if we start listing people's rights, that might be construed to mean those are the only rights you have. So we put the 9th Amendment in there as kind of a safety net, right? Hey, just because something's not written in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have that right. Good example is what we were talking about yesterday. We made up talked about that scenario of the students whose lockers were searched, and all of you said, well, there's a right to privacy. I would say, really? Find it in the Constitution. Guess what? You're not going to find it. It's not there. But the Supreme Court, Khaki, wake up.
I'm not a student.
The Supreme Court would argue there is a right to privacy. It's covered by the 9th Amendment. Right? It's covered by the 9th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says any powers not given to the national government belong to the states and the people. Any powers not given to the national government belong to the states and the people. That ties into that idea of a federal system. Remember, we were really worried about a too powerful national government. We wanted power shared between the national government and the state government. This was a way, bless you. This was a way to make sure that we shared that power. So a good example, right? Marriage. Issuing marriage licenses, that's not given to the national government. Providing schools, that's not given to the national government. If it's not given to the national government, it belongs to the states and the people. So that's what's in the Bill of Rights. First 10 amendments. Let's shift to part 2 of the lecture, which covers a really important concept that we need to understand in order to figure out how the Supreme Court does its job of upholding the Bill of Rights. And that's the concept of judicial review. So first off, I need to give you a definition of judicial review. Judicial review is the ability to review laws passed by Congress and actions of the executive branch to determine whether or not they are constitutional. I'll say that again. Judicial review is the ability to review laws passed by Congress and actions of the executive branch to determine if they are constitutional. If they are not, then the law or action is overturned. That's judicial review. The Constitution is the highest law in the country. So if anything done by the government goes against the Constitution, then it cannot stand. It is overturned.
You said if they are not what?
If it's found to not be constitutional, right, then that law or that action is overturned. And this also applies to states as well, right? So we said laws passed by Congress, right, but also laws passed by states. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. States are not allowed to violate the Constitution either. This power of judicial review it's the Supreme Court's most important power. It's really what makes it equal to the other branches. What would be kind of interesting would be if I said, okay, open those books on the table to the Constitution and find where it says the Supreme Court can do that. Find a judicial review in the Constitution. Guess what?
It's not there.
It's not there. Believe it or not, the Supreme Court's most important power was basically invented by one of the early Chief Justices of the Supreme Court in a case called Marbury v. Madison. Right? Marbury versus Madison. So I want to go over that with you. All right? Important to understand, right? The Constitution does not actually give the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. An early Chief Justice by the name of John Marshall basically invented the power.
Don't we have a John Marshall house here?
We do! There's a John Marshall House. There's also a John Marshall High School here in Richmond because he lived here.
Wait, what did he do? Where we got?
He invented judicial review.
Oh, okay.
Come on, Khaki.
Swing.
I know it's early in the morning, but dig deep. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who pretty much invented this power. In the case Marbury versus Madison. So I want to give you some background of this case so that you see how the power came to be. Now, I'm not going to quiz you on the details of the case, but it's important to understand because this is how this power comes to be. You definitely need to understand the concept of judicial review. So in your notes, make sure that you get down, right, that John Marshall, in the case Marbury versus Madison, this is the case where he established the concept of judicial review. But I'm not worried that you get all the specific details of the case. So here's how this case worked out. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams. Very bitter election. And right before John Adams was to leave office, he appointed a whole bunch of people to positions in the judicial branch, right? He appointed a whole bunch of judges, a whole bunch of other government officials, and he was rushing to get all of these appointments delivered before Thomas Jefferson became president.
All these appointments,
Appointments, right? He appointed all of these people, right? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were from different political parties, right? So John Adams wants to appoint as many people as he can before he leaves office. Think about federal judges. How long do they serve for? Life, right? So if he can put a whole bunch of people from his political party into those positions, they serve for life, right? So he's trying to rush all these appointments through. But he doesn't get all of them delivered before Thomas Jefferson takes over. So you're Thomas Jefferson. You become president. You go into the White House. You don't go into the Oval Office because it hasn't been built yet. But you go into the White House, and on your desk, you see this stack of papers, all of these appointments that have yet to be delivered. But those aren't your appointments. That's the last guy's appointments. And you don't like those appointments. What are you going to do? Not deliver them, right? Throw them away. That's exactly what he does. He refuses to deliver those appointments. One of those appointments that was not delivered was supposed to go to a guy by the name of William Marbury. Mr. Marbury is very upset because he was promised a job and he didn't get it. So he sues the executive branch. In particular, he sues the Secretary of State, James Madison. So the case is called Marbury versus Madison. And he wants the Supreme Court to force Thomas Jefferson to deliver the appointment.
But he wasn't the only one who didn't get the job.
Right, there's a bunch of other people too, but he's the one who sued. So William Marbury says, listen, Congress wrote a law that allows you to force the president to do something, right? It's a little more specific than that, but broadly speaking, says Congress passed a law that says that the Supreme Court can force the president to do something. And I want you to use that power to make him give me the appointment.
So basically what he was asking wasn't unconstitutional?
Hang on, we're getting there.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court is in a little bit of a pickle here. If John Marshall, who's the head of the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to make the president do that, how does that make the Supreme Court look? If they back down from the president, how does that make them look?
Weaker than the president.
Makes them look weak, right? If they back down, they're going to look weak. If they try to force the president to do it, and he refuses, how's the court going to look?
Still weak.
Still weak.
And pretty dumb.
Yeah, right? It's going to be like, so he's stuck in this tight spot. He goes, look, if I try to make him do it, he's going to say no, and we're going to look weak and powerless. If we back down, it's going to look like we're scared of the president, and we're weak and powerless, right? Neither way is good. John Marshall comes up with a genius solution. What he says, the ruling, is basically this. The Supreme Court tells William Marbury, you're right. You should get your appointment. The president should give it to you, and shame on him for not doing it. But unfortunately, the law you're referring to that tells us we have the power to make the president, that law goes against the Constitution, and therefore it's overturned. The end. Court dismissed. Right? And everyone's like, whoa, wait, what just happened? Right? You just made that power up. But nobody can really complain about it. The president can't complain about it because he's not being made to do anything. He basically, out of thin air, invents this power of judicial review. It says, that law is unconstitutional, and if it's unconstitutional, it may not remain. And ever since that case, the court has had this power, and it is its most important power. So again, I'm not going to ask you to recite all the details of that case, okay? But you do need to know that we remember that case because that's the one where he invents this power of judicial review. And you need to know what judicial review means. Not everybody's wild about judicial review. There are some real criticisms of judicial review. Judicial review allows the courts to cancel laws that have been passed by Congress and signed by the president. And some people view that as very undemocratic. Why do you think that is? Why do you think some people say judicial review is very undemocratic?
Because if two groups already agreed that this is an okay law or something, then just one group says it's not, then it's out.
Okay, true.
Well,
But what's it got to do with democracy?
Like the people who are living in these areas don't have any say at all. It's just
Don't have any say in what?
which law they think is constitutional.
Okay, closer. Who picks Congress? Who elects Congress?
People.
The people do. Who picks the president, though indirectly? The people do, right? The people vote for Congress, the people vote for president. Who picks Supreme Court judges? The president, right? People see judicial review as undemocratic because the people elect Congress and the people elect the president, but the people get no say whatsoever in who the Supreme Court judges are. Nobody elects Supreme Court justices. So some people argue it's not very fair for 9 unelected judges to overturn laws that were passed by people who were elected. I'll say that again. Some people, not everybody, some people argue it's not very democratic for 9 unelected judges to be able to overturn or throw out laws that were passed by people who were elected.
Does it happen that often that people get like, that upset about it? You know?
Pretty much any time the Supreme Court makes a ruling, you're going to have people who are upset about it. Which brings us to the final point of the lecture. What are your options? Right? What are your options if you don't like a Supreme Court ruling? If you're in that group that doesn't like the ruling, you really only have 2 options. Right? If you disagree with the Supreme Court, there's 2 options. Option number 1 is to try to amend the Constitution. Option number 1 is try to amend the Constitution. That's really the only surefire way, right? If you add something to the Constitution, it cannot possibly be unconstitutional, right? A good example of that is flag burning. Okay? Some people want to add an amendment that makes it illegal to burn the American flag. And we're going to look at a case that involves flag burning, okay? But the only way to make sure the court couldn't overturn that, for sure, would be to add it to the Constitution. If it's written into the Constitution, you can't say it's unconstitutional. But remember, changing the Constitution is really hard. Right? We studied that a week or 2 ago. That's a really difficult process. Your second option, and the one that more frequently happens, is you have to wait. You have to wait, and maybe down the road, the Supreme Court will change its mind. When new judges come on, as time goes by, the Supreme Court might change its own mind. Okay? All right, so in addition to tonight's homework, I want you to, if you need to go back and add a little more detail, feel free to go back to the video.